Have you noticed that some of the most frightened people are not the people far from Allah, but the people trying very hard to be close to Him? You pray. You say your adhkar. You whisper Bismillah before the meeting, before the difficult phone call, before opening the laptop, before driving somewhere, before speaking to someone you love. You do the right thing. You use the right words. And yet your chest still tightens like something is hunting you from the inside. You say Bismillah before the task, but you spend the next hour trying not to look weak. You say Bismillah before the conversation, but the whole conversation is still controlled by your need to be right. You make dhikr, but your mind keeps circling your future, your reputation, your failure, your image, your safety. And then a darker thought enters. If I am remembering Allah, why am I still this afraid? That question matters more than most people realize, because Ibn Arabi would tell you that this fear is not necessarily proof that your remembrance failed. It may be the exact place where your remembrance has begun exposing something in you that was never surrendered to Allah in the first place. For Ibn Arabi, the deepest problem is not merely that we fear too much. It is that we keep trying to live in the world in our own name with our own self as our shelter, our own image as our burden, our own control as our God, and then we wonder why the soul trembles under the weight of a life it was never designed to carry. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a believer can say Bismillah and still remain afraid, what Ibn Arabi's inner reading of this reveals about the ego, and how one true Bismillah can pull your soul out of fear and back under Allah's protection. In this video, we are going to look at 6 things. First, we will look at the hidden kind of fear. Many sincere Muslims carry the fear that survives even after worship. Then, we will uncover the first reason it survives. Because the nafs can hide inside religious language and still make everything about you. Then, we will go deeper and see why Ibn Arabi treats fear not only as an emotion, but as a sign that your heart has forgotten whose name it is actually living under. Then we will examine what Bismillah really does to the ego, not as a slogan, but as a transfer of ownership from self to Allah. Then we will face the most uncomfortable part, how even your desire to feel spiritually safe can become another form of self-protection. And finally, we will turn all of this into 3 concrete practices you can use tonight, so Bismillah stops being a phrase you start with, and becomes a place your soul returns to. The problem this video is trying to solve is not disbelief, it is not open sin, it is not even obvious religious laziness. It is something much more difficult to detect, because it can live inside a practicing Muslim life for years without being named. It is the life of someone who still obeys Allah outwardly, still cares deeply about their deen, still listens to reminders, still wants sincerity, still says Bismillah and Alhamdulillah and Astaghfirullah, but underneath all of that, they live with a constant undercurrent of self-consciousness, dread, exposure, and inner performance. They are afraid of making the wrong decision, afraid of being seen as inadequate, afraid of failing publicly, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of not being accepted by Allah, and sometimes, most painfully of all, afraid that even their spirituality has become another performance of the self. This is why Ibn Arabi matters here. Ibn Arabi is often presented as a mystical poet, a man of beautiful phrases and difficult metaphysics. But if you actually sit with his work, especially in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah and the Fusus al-Hikam, you find something much more rigorous. You find a physician of orientation, a thinker who does not stop at behavior and does not even stop at emotion. He asks a more frightening question: what reality are you standing inside when you feel what you feel? Under what name are you acting? What self are you trying to preserve? What do you believe actually has power over you? That is why his framework is so useful for a topic like fear. Ibn Arabi repeatedly treats actions as taking their true reality from the heart's orientation, not merely from the tongue's wording. He treats servanthood ubudiyya as liberation, because it relocates dependence from the fragile self to Allah. And he treats remembrance not as a magic sound, but as a reordering of presence, authorship, and relation. Modern psychology has a phrase for part of this mechanism: self-referential threat appraisal. Anxiety intensifies when the mind interprets events through a threatened self-image. What will happen to me? What will this say about me? How will I be seen? What if I am diminished? Science describes the loop. Ibn Arabi tells you what the loop is attached to spiritually. The nafs trying to remain central even while the tongue says Allah's name. And that is what makes this video different from standard reminders about Bismillah. Most content will tell you to say Bismillah for blessing. That is true. But Ibn Arabi forces a harder question. What if the reason Bismillah feels weak on your tongue is not because the phrase is weak, but because your ego is still trying to remain the one in charge after saying it? Think of Maryam. She is 29. She works as a product manager. She is visibly practicing, dependable, sharp, the kind of person people call when things fall apart, because she always seems composed. She has prayed Isha. She has closed her laptop. It is 11:40 at night. Tomorrow she has a presentation at work that matters to her. Before opening the document one last time, she says quietly, Bismillah. And within 3 minutes, she is not working anymore. She is spiraling. What if I freeze? What if they ask something I cannot answer? What if they realize I'm not as competent as they think I am? What if I embarrass myself? What if Allah lets me fail because my intentions were mixed? Look carefully at what just happened. Maryam began in Allah's name, but the rest of the night is being spent protecting Maryam. Protecting Maryam's image, Maryam's competence, Maryam's reputation, Maryam's moral self-story, even Maryam's idea of herself as a sincere Muslim. This is where Ibn Arabi gives you a diagnosis that is both compassionate and devastating. In the Futuhat, when he speaks about states of the heart, about fear, about reliance, about the servant's orientation toward Allah, he keeps returning to the same principle. The truth of an act is not measured only by the sound it makes. It is measured by where the heart is actually turning, what it is actually leaning on, and what it is secretly trying to secure. That means fear is not always random noise. Sometimes it is a disclosure. It shows you what your nafs thinks it must protect in order to survive. Maybe it is your image. Maybe it is your control. Maybe it is your competence. Maybe it is your innocence. Maybe it is your story about being the strong one, the spiritual one, the reliable one, the one who does not fail. The soul is not only afraid of pain. Very often, it is afraid of ego death. It is afraid of the collapse of a version of you that the nafs has grown dependent on. And this is where many sincere Muslims get confused, because they assume the presence of fear means the absence of faith. But Ibn Arabi would ask a different question. He would ask, what exactly is this fear trying to preserve? Because not all fear is the same. There is a fear that humbles you before Allah. That fear can be holy. It can be part of taqwa. It can be the trembling of a servant who knows Allah's majesty and fears the rejection of insincerity. But there is another fear, and this is the one we are talking about. That is not about Allah at all. It is about the self being exposed, the self being reduced, the self being seen as small, the self losing the illusion that it is in control. Modern psychology would call one part of this self-referential rumination. The mind begins looping around a threatened self-concept, not simply something bad might happen, but something bad might happen to me, and it will say something unbearable about who I am. Science can describe why the mind spirals when self-image is threatened. Ibn Arabi tells you what to do with that knowledge. Expose the lie that the self was ever meant to carry itself in the first place. Think of it this way. Imagine a tenant living in an apartment building who suddenly starts acting like the landlord. Every crack in the wall feels like his burden. Every broken pipe feels like his failure. Every threat to the building becomes personal because he has forgotten that he does not own the structure. That is the nafs. It panics because it has quietly claimed ownership over a life that was never its property. This is why Bismillah can feel weak when fear is strong, not because the phrase lacks power, but because the heart has not actually transferred ownership. The tongue says, "In the name of Allah," while the inner life is still screaming, "But I have to protect myself. I have to secure the outcome. I have to preserve the image. I have to survive this as me." And here is what most people miss. The most dangerous fear is not the fear of failure. It is the fear that reveals you have made your own self the thing you are serving. That is why this section matters. Because if you do not understand fear as a spiritual disclosure, you will keep treating symptoms while protecting the disease. You will keep trying to calm yourself without asking what false throne the fear is defending. So the next time you feel that post-worship dread, that strange anxiety after dhikr, that panic after saying Bismillah, do not ask only, "Why am I scared?" Ask a harder question. What version of me is this fear trying to keep alive? Your fear often reveals the idol your tongue has not confessed yet. But if fear can expose what the nafs is protecting, then what does Bismillah actually do to that false protector? That is where Ibn Arabi takes us next. Think of Yusuf. He is 34, a father of 2, respected in the masjid, dependable, generous, exhausted. For weeks there has been tension between him and his wife. Small things keep igniting into arguments. He has spent the day telling himself that tonight he is going to handle the conversation properly. No defensiveness, no raised voice, no ego. He stands outside the bedroom door, takes a breath, and says, Bismillah, and then the conversation begins. Within seconds, he is not listening. He is building a case. He needs to come out looking fair. He needs to prove he is not the bad one. He needs to protect his authority. He needs to avoid feeling small. He needs to win without looking like he wants to win. So even when his words sound calm, the room is still full of Yusuf. Yusuf's pride, Yusuf's defensiveness, Yusuf's need to preserve the image of being the reasonable one. The conversation collapses, not because he forgot to say Bismillah, but because he entered the room in Yusuf's name. This is where Ibn Arabi's language of Ubudiyya becomes essential. In the Futuhat, and throughout his treatment of the servant's station, Ibn Arabi keeps returning to one of the most liberating and humiliating truths in the path. Your nobility is not in becoming self-sufficient. Your nobility is in realizing your poverty before Allah so completely that you stop pretending to be your own source, your own refuge, your own author. That is what servanthood is. Not a decorative religious identity, not a humble tone of voice, not a low self-esteem performance. Servanthood is the truth that you do not own yourself, do not sustain yourself, do not control outcomes, and do not enter moments with your own independent sufficiency. So when you say Bismillah, if the phrase is real, what you are actually saying is not Allah, bless my agenda. You are saying, Allah, remove me from centrality. I do not own this moment. I do not author its outcome. I do not enter it with my own sufficiency. I do not need to preserve my image at all costs. I do not get to make my ego the operating system of this conversation. That is why Bismillah is so much bigger than people think. It is not a religious garnish sprinkled over an already self-authored life. It is not a spiritual sticker you place on top of your anxiety while continuing to worship control underneath. It is a transfer of authorship. It is the servant stepping out of their own name. This is why the Quranic world of Bismillah matters so much. When Allah teaches us Bismillah, ir-Rahman, ir-Rahim, this is not simply a verbal opener. It is a way of entering reality under divine lordship, mercy, authorship, and protection. The phrase is telling you where to stand before you act. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Many of us do not actually want Allah's name as shelter. We want Allah's name as reinforcement for our ego. We want Bismillah to help us preserve our image, to help us win the argument, to help us succeed without humiliation, to help us stay admired, to help us control the outcome while feeling religious. But Bismillah is not a blessing on your ego's plan. It is your exit from it. Imagine trying to cross a dangerous border using a counterfeit passport once stamped with your own fragile authority, your own face, your own invented credentials. Of course, every checkpoint terrifies you. The document is false. The name you are entering under has no real authority. That is the ego. It tries to move through life under forged papers. My control, my image, my competence, my innocence, my power. Bismillah is the opposite. It is the only true passport. It is the soul saying, I refuse to enter this moment in the counterfeit authority of myself. And this changes the question entirely. The question is no longer, did I say Bismillah before the conversation? The question becomes, did I actually leave myself when I said it? Did I leave my need to dominate? Did I leave my need to look holy? Did I leave my need to protect the image of being right? Did I leave my demand that Allah support my ego's emergency management system? Because if the nafs remains central, Bismillah can be repeated while fear remains untouched. The phrase may be on the tongue, but the self has not moved an inch. And once you see that, you start hearing your own life differently. You start noticing how often you invoke Allah while still standing in your own name. You say Bismillah before opening your inbox, but the inbox is still about your validation. You say Bismillah before studying, but the studying is still about your worth. You say Bismillah before apologizing, but the apology is still about keeping your image intact. That is not a failure of the phrase. It is a refusal of the transfer. Bismillah is not a blessing on your ego's plan. It is your exit from it. But if leaving your own name is the beginning of freedom, then what exactly makes that so painful? Why does the soul resist it so violently? To answer that, we have to go deeper into what fear is actually grieving. Think of Amina. She is 26. She studies Quran. She writes thoughtful reflections online. People message her for advice. She is sincere in many ways, and yet there is a private fragility in her that she has not named. One evening she posts something about tawakkul, a short reflection, carefully written, beautiful enough to sound effortless. Usually her posts receive a lot of engagement. This one does not. She checks once. Then again. Then again. By the end of the night, she feels heavy, ashamed, irritable, spiritually fake. She tells herself she does not care, but she cares enough to feel injured. She tries to make dhikr before sleep, but her heart is not grieving distance from Allah in that moment. It is grieving the collapse of a version of Amina. The admired one, the articulate one, the spiritually deep one, the one who is sane. This is where Ibn Arabi becomes almost terrifyingly precise, because he keeps reminding the reader that created forms are contingent, unstable, passing. Everything you keep trying to make permanent in creation, your role, your reputation, your status, your emotional certainty, your control, even your image of yourself is unstable by nature, because it is created. And yet the nafs keeps building homes in passing things, and then screaming when those homes shake. That is what fear often is. Not merely fear of an event, not merely fear of pain, but fear because the self has mistaken something unstable for its real identity. In the Fusus al-Hikam, and throughout the Akbarian worldview, the servant has no independent standing before the real. Everything is received, everything is contingent, everything exists through Allah's sustaining act. But the nafs hates this poverty. It wants independent solidity. It wants a self it can point to and say, this is me, this is secure, this is mine, this is stable. So it builds a palace out of spider silk. A palace made of admiration, a palace made of competence, a palace made of being needed, a palace made of always being right, a palace made of being spiritually impressive, a palace made of being the one who has it together. And then the wind comes, someone criticizes you. A plan fails, a post gets ignored, a marriage exposes your selfishness, a friend disappoints you, a child does not admire you, a parent disapproves, a project collapses, your heart feels dry in worship, and suddenly you do not just feel inconvenience, you feel annihilation. Why? Because sometimes fear is grief over an identity withdrawal. That is the part many viewers have never considered. Some of what you call anxiety is not simply fear of the future. It is mourning for a false self that is losing one of its favorite mirrors. You are not only afraid of being disliked. You are afraid because a version of you that lived off being admired is starving. You are not only afraid of failure. You are afraid because a version of you that worshipped competence is being humiliated. You are not only afraid of being misunderstood. You are afraid because a version of you that needed to be seen as good is being dragged into the light. This does not mean your pain is fake. It means your pain has a spiritual architecture. Modern psychology would describe part of this as identity threat. When a person fuses their worth with a role, an image, or a social reflection, even a small loss can feel catastrophic because the nervous system experiences it as a threat to the self. Science can describe the injury. Ibn Arabi tells you the deeper problem. The self that feels annihilated was never stable enough to be your Lord in the first place. That is why this section matters so much. Because the problem is not only that you fear the world too much. The problem is that you are still trying to survive as someone other than a servant. And once that lands, many of your private spiritual confusions start rearranging themselves. Why did that criticism hurt so much? Why did that unanswered message ruin your night? Why did that public mistake feel unbearable? Why did that spiritual dryness make you panic? Why did that ignored effort make you feel invisible? Sometimes the answer is not simply, I am weak. Sometimes the answer is, a false god in me is losing one of its thrones. Some fears are just the ego mourning a throne it feels slipping. But if fear is the grief of a false self losing power, then what would actually loosen that fear? Not suppress it, not decorate it, loosen it. This is where Ibn Arabi brings us to the heart of the matter. Think of Ammar. He is 41, he owns a small business. He is carrying debt, family pressure, bills he is tired of looking at, and a private shame he has not said out loud to anyone. His trust in Allah feels weaker than it used to. He still prays, he still gives, he still says the right things. But lately he wakes before Fajr with a pressure in his chest that feels like a hand tightening around his ribs. One morning he sits on the prayer mat in the dark, and realizes something that terrifies him. He is not only afraid of losing money, he is afraid of becoming the man who failed, the man who could not provide, the man who disappointed his family, the man whose life story bent in the wrong direction. He lowers his head and says, slowly, Bismillah, ir-Rahman, ir-Rahim. Then again. At first, nothing changes. The bills are still there, the uncertainty is still there, the storm has not ended, but something begins to shift in the question inside him. He stops asking, how do I save myself? And starts feeling something much truer. I was never asked to be my own Lord. That is the turn. And this is where Ibn Arabi resolves everything that came before. The Bismillah that lifts fear is not a charm that erases uncertainty. It is not a spell that guarantees emotional calm. It is not a formula that forces life to become manageable. It is a return to ontology, a return to what is real. Allah is the real. You are the servant. Outcomes belong to Him. Provision belongs to Him. Openings belong to Him. Contractions belong to Him. Visibility belongs to Him. Obscurity belongs to Him. Safety belongs to Him. Exposure belongs to Him. Your dignity is not in controlling events. Your dignity is in standing truthfully in ubudiyah. That is why the highest station in Ibn Arabi's framework is not spiritual achievement. It is not self-mastery in the modern performance sense. It is servanthood, the station in which you stop demanding that your soul occupy a place only Allah can occupy. And this changes the meaning of Bismillah completely. Now Bismillah is no longer, please make this go well. It becomes, I enter this under Allah's name, not mine. If I am opened, it is His. If I am blocked, it is His. If I am seen, it is His. If I am hidden, it is His. My task is adab, truthfulness, obedience, repentance, and surrender. Look at the difference. Before, Bismillah was being used like emotional insurance. Now it becomes a relocation of custody. And that is why fear begins to loosen, not always because the future becomes predictable, but because the self is no longer trying to sit where only Allah belongs. The Quran gives us one of the most beautiful images for this in the story of Nuh. Allah says, "Board in it, in the name of Allah is its course and its anchorage." Even the ark does not travel in its own name. Even survival through the flood is framed by divine authorship. Motion in His name, rest in His name, passage in His name, anchorage in His name. That is the invitation of Bismillah. Not just start in His name, travel in His name, rest in His name, fear in His name, wait in His name, speak in His name, enter the storm in His name, anchor the storm in His name. There is a sentence here that changes everything if you really let it in. Bismillah is not primarily a way to make the world safer. It is a way to make you smaller in the right way, small enough to fit back into servanthood. That smallness is not degradation, it is relief. Imagine a child caught in a storm. The child does not calm down because the storm instantly stops. The child calms down because he is finally in the right hand. The same rain may still be falling. The same thunder may still be sounding. But the burden of self-protection has changed, because the child is no longer alone with his fear. That is what one true Bismillah can do to the soul. It places you back in the right hand, not by removing all uncertainty, but by removing the lie that you were ever meant to carry yourself through uncertainty as your own protector. And when that happens, even if fear remains in some form, it no longer rules with the same dictatorship. It no longer has the same throne. It no longer gets to define reality. It becomes a passing weather inside a larger sky of servanthood. So, the title of this video matters here. The one Bismillah that lifted fear was not magic because of its syllables. It was powerful because it was true. It was a real act of transfer, a real surrender of authorship, a real return from self-custody to divine custody. Fear loosens when the self stops trying to be its own protector. But there is still one deeper layer we have to face, because once you hear all of this, a new question appears. Why would Allah sometimes let fear remain even after Bismillah? Why not remove it immediately? That is where the deepest paradox begins. The obvious way to understand this topic is simple. Say Bismillah, so Allah removes your fear. And of course, there is truth in that. There is barakah in Allah's name. There is protection in Allah's name. There is mercy in Allah's name. But if we stop there, we miss the part Ibn Arabi would force us to look at. Sometimes Allah leaves some fear in place, until Bismillah has removed you from the center of the fear. That is the paradox. Most mainstream advice treats Bismillah like a spiritual comfort technique. Say it before driving. Say it before entering the house. Say it before studying. Say it before conflict. Say it before sleep. All of that is good. All of it is true. But it can still remain shallow if the phrase is being used only to make the nervous system feel safer, while the ego stays untouched. Ibn Arabi's world is too serious for that. For him, remembrance is not mainly about getting the universe to cooperate with your emotional preferences. It is about restoring the right relationship between the servant and the real. Which means, you may say Bismillah and still feel fear not because Allah ignored you, not because the phrase failed, but because the phrase has begun exposing how much of your life is still organized around preserving a self other than the servant. And sometimes the first mercy of that exposure is not peace. It is humiliation. Not humiliation in front of people. Humiliation of the nafs. Bismillah shows you how controlling you are, how image-hungry you are, how attached you are to being seen as good, how desperate you are to remain innocent in your own eyes, how little of your trust has actually left your own hands. And that humiliation is mercy, because it breaks the illusion that your fear problem is out there. It reveals that the deeper prison is internal. The prison is self-reference, self-lordship, self-custody, the self trying to remain the center of the story while using Allah's name as decoration. So the real question is not, how do I use Bismillah to stop feeling bad? The real question is, how do I let Bismillah dismantle the false self that keeps producing this fear? That is the reversal. Bismillah is not only consolation, it is a knife. It cuts the knot between fear and self-worship. It cuts the counterfeit passport. It cuts the forged landlord claim. It cuts the spiderweb palace. It cuts the ego's secret throne. And only then does peace begin to mean something deeper than emotional relief. Because peace is not merely the absence of fear. Peace is the end of your soul trying to belong to itself. So how do you actually live this tonight? Not in theory, not as a beautiful concept. Tonight, the first practice is what I would call the ownership audit. Before any stressful task, difficult conversation, decision, or anxiety spiral, take out your phone or a piece of paper and write 3 sentences. What am I afraid of right now? What exactly am I trying to protect? What identity would feel threatened if this goes badly? Do not rush this. Be honest. Maybe the answer is not I'm afraid of failing. Maybe it is I'm afraid of looking foolish. I'm afraid of losing control. I'm afraid people will see I'm not who I pretend to be. Once you name it, say one deliberate Bismillah, and then say, Ya Allah, I return this outcome, this image, and this fear to your ownership. My job is obedience, not self-preservation. Why does this matter? Because it is tied directly to the first teaching, fear reveals what the nafs is protecting. Psychologically, this is a form of cognitive diffusion and threat labeling. You stop drowning in the fear long enough to identify the false self inside it. The second practice is Bismillah before the first reaction. Choose one trigger for the next week: criticism, delay, marital conflict, work stress, embarrassment. When the trigger hits, do not answer immediately. Pause for 5 seconds. Say Bismillah ir-Rahman ir-Rahim. Then ask yourself one question. If I respond as a servant and not as a wounded self, what changes in my next sentence? That single pause can save you from entire nights of regret. It is tied to the second teaching, get out of your own name. Psychologically, it interrupts the automatic defense script and gives your values a chance to enter before your ego does. The third practice is the nightly false throne muhasabah. Before sleep, ask yourself, where did I feel disproportionately shaken today? What false throne was threatened there? Competence, admiration, control, innocence, being right, being needed. Can I say Bismillah over that exact throne and surrender it? Then end with this dua: You Allah, do not let me worship a self you are trying to heal by exposing. This is tied to teachings 3 and 4. Fear as ego grief, Bismillah as return to servanthood. And psychologically, it reframes the memory of the day, so that fear stops being interpreted only as danger and starts being read as information. The point of these practices is not to become emotionally invincible by bedtime. The point is to stop letting fear remain anonymous. Once fear is named, once the false throne is exposed, once Bismillah becomes a real transfer instead of a verbal habit, the soul starts learning where it actually belongs. So now go back to the person we began with. The person who says Bismillah and still feels afraid. The person who prays and still spirals. The person who remembers Allah and still feels the pressure of image, control, failure, and exposure tightening in the chest. Maybe you were never crazy. Maybe you were not simply failing at dhikr. Maybe you were standing in the exact place where Allah was showing you something most people spend years avoiding. Look how much of your fear is tied to protecting a self I never asked you to carry. That is the gift hidden inside this discomfort. The point of this video was never to turn Bismillah into a formula for instant emotional relief. It was to let you hear it the way Ibn Arabi forces the soul to hear it, as a rescue from self-lordship. So the next time you whisper Bismillah before the meeting, before the apology, before the prayer, before the difficult message, before the family conversation, before sleep, before another anxious night, know what you are actually saying. I do not enter this in my own name. I do not protect myself by myself. I do not belong to the image I am trying to save. I belong to Allah. And if fear is still there, let that not be the end of the conversation. Let it become the beginning of a better one. Ask it what it is defending. Ask it whose throne it is protecting. Ask it what false version of you it is terrified to lose. Then say Bismillah again, not as a charm, but as a surrender. Because the Bismillah that heals fear is the one that removes your soul from your own custody. So here is the question I want to leave you with. The last time you became afraid, truly afraid, what were you actually trying to keep alive? Your trust in Allah, or a version of yourself you were terrified to lose?